My name is Gurbeer Singh, PhD student here at UC Riverside, third year. And I'll be introducing this panel, Sikh Sovereignties and Sikh Art. Going first will be Dr. Nirinjan Khalsa from Loyola Marymount University, presenting Sikhing Sovereignties amidst state violence. Dr. Khalsa is a senior instructor of theology studies at Loyola Marymount University, where she also served as a clinical professor in Jain and Sikh Studies and acting director of graduate yoga studies. Her ethnographic research and publications investigate historic, modern, and transnational Gurbani Kirtan by using a decolonial lens to explore diversity and gender roles in Sikh identity, pedagogy, and practice. Throughout her scholarship and teaching, she highlights the importance of embodied practices to cultivate ethical action in daily life. She currently serves as co-chair of the Sikh Studies Unit at AAR and book review editor for the Sikh Formations Journal. Without further ado, I give you the virtual podium.
Thank you so much, Gurbeer Singh. It's so wonderful to be here, and I really appreciate being on this panel with my fellow colleagues, and I've really enjoyed the talks that have been happening at this conference yesterday and today, and I'm really honored to be presenting here today. So I'm going to share my screen, and please help me keep track of time.
Yeah, I'll text you. Everyone has 20 minutes each. I'm not texting you, I'll Q&A, like the chat function you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm waiting for it to show up on my screen. Great, here we are. Okay, so the title that I had was something that I've been kind of struggling with, thinking about what exactly I would be discussing at the conference today. So I have a lot of areas that I'm gonna move into, and these are mostly just areas for exploration that I've been looking into, thinking about my teaching as well as my scholarship. So the path of Guru Nanak through Guru Gobind Singh offers a revolutionary way of being in the world as both sovereign and deeply interconnected with others. They offer a pluriversal perspective of interconnected oneness beyond man-made boundaries that care for the other as the self. And it's a model that we need now more than ever. During a time when a global pandemic is taking the lives of our families and friends, when fear and insecurity are driving separatist ideologies and isolationist mentalities, when protesters are in the streets declaring that Black Lives Matter, that the plight of farmers affects us all, when women are no longer willing to remain silent in the face of sexual violence under patriarchal law, when our ecosystems and indigenous streams of knowledge are being destroyed due to human negligence, ignorance, and self-centered economies, the teachings of the Sikh Gurus echo as a reminder of the divine light that shines within all life, human and non-human. It causes me to question how we can apply the expansive vision of Guru Nanak and the Sikh Gurus to our own self-understanding of Sikhi, beyond the colonizing logic that uses the tactics of divide and conquer to separate us from our own interconnected reality. And so here I have, you may have seen this already, some health workers in Spain reciting the Mo mantra as they're taking care of COVID patients, and just seeing how Sikhi travels through the world and how it's being used now during this time. here I also have some people that were on a yatra in Sultanpur Lodi to celebrate Guru Nanak's 550th birth anniversary. Here you'll just see the ways in which Sikhi has traveled. It continues to travel through various languages, geographies, and ethnicities and races. So we're seeing different expressions of Sikhi beyond borders. This beyondness extends beyond state national borders, beyond state power, into the mystic realm of Guru Nanak, who declares na koi Hindu, na koi Musalman. And so I'm going to, let's see, I was going to fast forward a little bit towards the end. So that kirtan is, some of the people that were playing are the Chardi Kala Jetta. That's a part of the 3HO Sikh community that I was raised in and born into. So questions of identity have always been central to my own exploration as a Sikh. I was raised in the 3HO Sikh community where Yogi Bhajan taught Kundalini Yoga. Our understanding of Sikhi then was filtered through his teachings, which brought in a broad sense of Indian spirituality, yoga, Ayurveda, without implications of caste and Indian political dynamics, but within a 1970s American Judeo-Christian paradigm, which our parents were struggling to break free from. At the same time, we were raised Khalsa Sikhs. I grew up wearing bana through elementary school and a turban through high school. The students who went to school in India, practiced Shastra Vidya, as did I, weapons training, meditation, sadhana, rising early in the Amrit Vela, doing japji, going to Gurdwara every morning. So these practices are all beautiful, and they gave us a deep connection to Sikhi and the embodied experience of Ekankar beyond language, ethnicity, geography, and background. But we were taught that exclusivity was not part of Sikhi, but at the same time, we were told that the way that we were practicing Sikhi as Khalsa was the right and true way. Our parents had left their families to become Sikhs and wanted to do it right, to adopt Sikhi for themselves and their children. They wanted to be seen and acknowledged as Sikhs. But in doing so, there were boundaries created, a type of communalism and superiority complex. And we were both insiders and outsiders. So as the second generation went to school in India, we tried to create ties across Sikh communities. Now this 50-year-old community has become an international community with people newly exposed to Sikh teachings through Kundalini Yoga and the Japji, which has been translated into 19 different languages, and people becoming Sikhs from diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds. This past year, the community has been reckoning with cases of sexual abuse by Yogi Bhajan and circles of silence and harm within the community. They've also been acknowledging the white centering and gatekeeping and are awakening to the need to more deeply engage with Punjabi Sikh communities and be reflective about white supremacy and racial hierarchies within these spaces. I now teach at a private Catholic Jesuit university where we are looking at the colonial hegemony of white Christian supremacy. So I've been thinking a lot about translation. When we translate between Abrahamic audiences so that Sikhs can be seen, recognized, and understood, trying to convey in words that people can understand while also asking them to dig deeper. So I've been thinking a lot about what is lost and what is gained in this process of translation between cultures, epistemes, ways of thinking and seeing. Both that it can be open to new possibilities, but there has to be a willingness to engage and listen to one another. And I'm thinking about this in relation to the harm and violence that has been caused. So Sikhs needing to be acknowledged and seen, but then issues of assimilation and what I've been also hearing other people talk about is this understanding of the need for indigenous native terms and to decolonize the field. So I have my students go through a worldviews practice. We interrogate the ways in which we see the world, and this is an attempt to reorient our worldviews or habitus to destabilize Euro-Christian white centrism, and really look at the problems with exclusivist theologies and ideologies, which promote isolationist and separatist and dualistic thinking about us versus them. It promotes hierarchies, that there's this evolutionary way of thinking about cultures and religions and societies. And so to deconstruct all of this and think about who we count as we, while at the same time acknowledging the hypocrisies that are within religious communities, and that exclusivism can be a part of minoritized religious communities as well to protect themselves from external forces. So we talk about exclusivism as entitlement, elitism. It can come in the form of arrogance, and inclusivism, though it could be understood as helpful and welcomed and included, it's also within a particular paradigm. And so the problem is that it homogenizes difference in this process of translation. It creates boundaries between us and them. It tries to assimilate everyone into a majoritarian consciousness. So both exclusivism and inclusivism create boundaries. They keep, and this is a violence, it keeps people either out or in. It can be safe, but it can be restrictive and confined as well. And so these ideas about pluralism also offer a difference, diversity or a multiplicity. It allows for us to go beyond borders, but it also can end up being too relativistic. And it also doesn't really truly engage with those that have more conservative belief systems, and it creates then resistance and resentment. And so I've been really interested in thinking about how we can better look at engagement and encounter with one another, how we can truly listen and learn from one another to deepen our own understandings. And so this is the process of doing theology. I think my slides are out of sync. Let me shift forward. Okay, I lost a slide. I'm gonna go back. So this is the process of doing theology. At this institution, we look at interfaith perspectives. So I was hired to teach Jainism and Sikhism initially. At this university, it was a 3-year endowed position. And being a Jesuit university, it's private, I teach in a theology department, it was allowing me to open up to really think about theology and what theological concepts mean as being commitments to central ideas of a religion, this idea that theology is faith-seeking understanding. And so when I think about Khalsa commitments to the ways in which Khalsa identity markers of dress and actions, I see it then as not a requirement, but a response to these particular commitments, a responsibility and a duty to uphold these ways of practice. And it requires practice and action. So we can't just think it into being, it requires an engagement. And so the students in the courses, they engage with Sikhi. And we've had some conferences around this interfaith engagement with this first conference, the Music and Poetics of Devotion and the Sikh and Jain traditions. We also looked at this interaction when we think about spiritual warriors and what it means to actually live these practices as a spiritual warrior. How do we embody this practice of fighting Kam, Krodh, Lobh, Moh, Ahankar? What does that mean? And so students also engage in these practices. We have engaged learning where they practice seva, they practice Nam Simran, they look at how the embodiment of these practices is allowing us to embody these commitments and these ideas that we have for ourselves. So they transform a practitioner. It's this creative act of renewal. And I think about this also then within so the students really are able to grow as people. They see that they're not only exposed to the ideas of Sikhi, but it impacts their worldview and their own spirituality. So how this type of engagement really informs who they are and how they want to act and live in the world, how they want to see, think, and be. And this idea of embodying Gurbani then is something that was central to my own work. I've studied within the Gurbani Kirtan Parampara with 13th generation exponent Bhai Baldeep Singh. I've interviewed many extant memory bearers of the Sikh tradition, capturing their oral narratives, and I was sure to interview those who were around during partition, and trying to capture that knowledge that was there prior to colonization. And so what was so fascinating to me was that the argument of the Parampara is that it's not exclusivist, that tradition is not about being exclusivist, it's actually about embodying knowledge, and that through that act of embodiment, it can travel through time and space. It is open to a plural mode of engagement through time and space. It's a dialogue between the past and the present. And so it's a decentralized practice. It's open to everyone. And I see it then as being transgressive of these normative barriers that we end up putting in place. And so I'm really interested in how we can embody this concept of embodying the Sikh concepts to balance inequality and respond to abuses of power. How can we expand Sikhi and find acceptance of diversity within our Sikh spaces? And how can we do this without completely shattering the importance and the cohesiveness of Sikh identity? So these questions about who is a Sikh, who has the right to speak for Sikhs and the Sikh experience has been something that I've been pondering. And then also, how does money, power, and authority affect who is authorized to represent the Sikh values and Sikh voices? And how is Sikh subjectivity affected by power structures, including those of the nation state? So these led me into another conference I organized, was the 350th birth anniversary of Guru Gobind Singh Ji. So on Friday, November 10th in 2017, I hosted a one-day seminar at Loyola Marymount University to commemorate Guru Gobind Singh's 350th birth anniversary, and to share his powerful and timely message: recognize humanity as one. Manasa ki jaat eka sabe eka pachanabo, excuse me. This event was part of multiple worldwide events funded by the Indian Ministry of Culture throughout that year, including large-scale celebrations in Patna, Bihar, which I had participated in during the new year. So I was able to go and participate in those. So Sikhs from around the globe were gathered for these celebrations, and many were heartened by the fact that the Indian government had spent hundreds of crore that year to honor the life of Guru Gobind Singh and his legacy of fighting for individual and communal sovereignty. So I had been engaging in these other events where people were feeling like finally some money was being spent on honoring the Sikh community and the Sikh gurus. So the donors of my Sikh and Jain professorship encouraged me to host this event, working with the Indian consulate and the local Sikh Sangat, this event at the university. It would be an opportunity for positive collaboration and bridge building between Sikh scholars, Sangat, and the Indian government, who have historically displayed distrust and antagonism. They also saw it as an opportunity to garner further support for the interfaith Sikh-Jain position that we were trying to continue. However, it became clear that many in the Sikh community were not supportive of such collaborations. The event brought together international speakers and musicians, Sikh Sangat, as well as non-Sikh students and professors from LMU and the surrounding University of California schools. The seminar began with Gurbani Kirtan, and then the Indian Consul General, Ambassador Ashok, was invited to give the inaugural address, at which point a Sikh man from Northern California rose in protest, saying, "You are a coward. You have killed so many people in New Delhi. We are suffering. You are coming here representing the government. You say Guru Gobind Singh is the defender of truth. You right here are representing untruth." This man's brother had been tortured in 1984, I later found out. He spoke against the atrocities the Indian government has continued to... Sorry. As you can tell, it was an emotional experience, and the atrocities that the Indian government has continued to inflict against the Sikh community, even now that we're witnessing with the Kisan Morcha. So my emotion is related to all of the violence that has continued to be perpetrated against the Sikh community throughout its history. But also as a teacher and a scholar, it awakened me to the diverse and often divergent political approaches and agendas of Sikh scholars, donors, universities, and governments in the US, in India, and throughout the diaspora. Sikhs continue to expand into diverse geographic, linguistic, ethnic, racial, and national identities. The question of who represents Sikhi becomes a contested landscape, particularly when Sikhs are precarious and a vulnerable minority that continues to experience hate crimes, state surveillance, and violence. What is at stake and what's the cost of representing the multiple identities of Sikhi within growing ethno-nationalist dialogues? What does it mean for scholars to work both within and against institutions or at the intersections of power? So I'm thinking even of like donors, communities, universities, governments, religious institutions. Can we build bridges from the inside while at the same time supporting protests from the outside? What is my role as a white female Sikh scholar in the Sikh struggle for sovereignty, who experiences Punjab as a spiritual religious homeland, but does not have ethnic, racial, nor ancestral connections to Punjabi identity and state violence, yet experiences the vicarious trauma of religious persecution over spatio-temporalities? In what ways, looking at my chat. Oh, okay, took too long. Let me go back. In what ways does my positionality make it possible or impossible to speak between differences in the Sikh experience? So the Sikh community has been in a state of precarity for most of its history with imperial, colonial, and state-sanctioned violence. What is the role of scholars in responding to the trauma of such violence? How does precarity affect scholars on multiple fronts with threats by those within and outside of the Sikh community? So I've been looking at the activist scholar model to build bridges between scholarship and engagement with a community that is in jeopardy every day. I found that building friendship and solidarity, showing up in community spaces, working with activists and advocacy groups has been helpful, finding ways that we as scholars can be plurivocal or polylingual, allowing us to engage with one another and learn from one another. Understanding these issues of assimilation, of translatability, and how we can build alliances with one another, while also recognizing the necessity of activists and advocates. They have this necessity to make Sikhi intelligible to interfaith communities, students, political leaders, and institutions of power, so that we can be seen and understood to not be harmed or killed. So we can allow for these conversations. They might be messy, may take courage, but it's through what Saba Mahmood calls a virtue of humility. And so I'll wrap it up to kind of go towards my conclusion of thinking about humility, which is the absence of how ma. It does not resort to our ego-centered, our ego self-centered nature, or this I am-ness that puts ourselves in opposition to all others. So I feel like we need a culture shift beyond these oppositional binaries. And this is what I've heard a lot of people talk about when we think about ideas of Sikh sovereignty. So when we turn to the Sikh concept of sovereignty of the Gurmukh, we see it, it's different than the notion of freedom, driven by autonomy, individualism, and ego agency, which operates in a dualistic consciousness of the Manmukh. Jakit Singh, in his paper Religious Agency, The Limits of Intersectionality, refers to this oppositional consciousness of the secular, humanist, autonomous subject. So the Sikh concept of sovereignty is different than the autonomic sovereignty of the ego subject, which was imported into modern Sikh subjectivity by colonialism and ethno-nationalism. How do we get beyond this oppositional consciousness, this ego-based dualistic consciousness that pits us versus them? So I'm thinking about decolonizing, how we move away from this to this multiplicity and multiple forms of subjectivity. And by realizing Guru Nanak's vision of Ek Onkar, a sovereignty of consciousness that can straddle the political and spiritual realms, the midi and the pity, to be in a state of sahaj with all life. So today, as Sikhs live throughout the diaspora and are subjected to majoritarian rule, rather than resisting or being subjected to this type of majoritarian consciousness, we see the productive possibilities of embracing an interrelational subjectivity as a transpersonal sovereignty. This type of thinking, acting and being between cultures, languages, concepts, opens up creative forms of agency beyond universalizing worldviews and normative identities towards a path of becoming, and what Mandira's referred to as a diasporicity, an embodied mindfulness as a state of encounter and sharing with the other. So I've been appreciating this idea of diasporic consciousness, and he also talks about poetic consciousness, this joyful sovereignty of creativity. And so I think of it as the state of Chardi Kala, where creativity is ever flowing. Thank you.
Thank you so much on your talk, Dr. Khalsa. It was very intriguing on the ideas of sovereignty in today's diverse month. Moving on quickly due to time, we have next Dr. Cassio. She will be presenting her talk called Sikh Musicology in the Western Academy, the Challenges of Intersectional Research and Decolonized Education. And her Dr. Francesca Cassio is full professor of music at Hofstra University in New York, and since 2011 holds the Sardarni Harbans Chair in Sikh Musicology, the first academic position of its kind in the United States. Italian-born ethnomusicologist specializing in South Asian music since the early 1990s, Dr. Cassio conducted long-term fieldwork in North India, where she also received intensive training in vocal music. Engaging her experimental approach as a musician with ethnographic research and musicological analysis, Dr. Cassio studies mainly focus on the music literature of Dhrupad and Gurbani Sangeet. Her current areas of interest are decoloniality, Sikh migration and diaspora in Southern Europe, and music making at the intersection of religious practices and gender ideologies. Prior to joining Hofstra, Dr. Cassio was lecturer of ethnomusicology at the University of Trento, professor of Hindustani music at the Conservatory of Vicenza, lecturer of anthropology of music at Conservatory of Adria in Italy, and visiting professor at Viswabharati University in India. Dr. Cassio authored a book on Dhrupad, and her essays are published in various languages and edited volumes in academic journals. She is currently working on a monograph about decolonial approaches in the Sikh field of musicology, and is co-editing a volume with Balwinder Pogal that collects the proceedings of the interdisciplinary conference Ek Anek, Guru Nanak's Pluriversal Vision, that was held at Hofstra in October 2019 to celebrate Guru Nanak's 550th birth anniversary. And without further ado, I give you the podium, Dr. Cassio.
Sat Sri Akal and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Gurbeer Singh, for the introduction, and Professor Pashura Singh for inviting me to the 7th conference of the Dr. Jasbir Singh Saini Chair in Sikh Studies. It is an honor to be part of this great pool of senior and junior colleagues, and I'm pleased that Sikh musicology is increasingly becoming a regular feature of Sikh Studies conferences. Last year, we have lost 2 senior leaders of the Sikh community who contributed with pioneering projects to promote Sikh studies in the canvas of American universities. I'm talking of Dr. Nirinjan Singh and Dr. Hakam Singh. This latter was the donor of the Sardarni Urban Score Chair in Sikh Musicology at Hofstra University. And to his memory, I dedicate this paper. My talk ideally continues what has been discussed yesterday, and I will touch upon Sikh musicology as an interdisciplinary field and how to decolonize Western academia to re-engineer the machine starting from college education. I will also discuss audible coloniality and how critical thinking requires also critical listening. Sikh musicology can be indeed a great asset for Sikh studies if it is not ghettoized in the art box. Before I delve into these arguments, I will first outline a brief history of Sikh musicology that, although established only at the beginning of the 21st century, already includes diverse orientations. Early research interests revolved around the polarized debate concerning, on the one hand, the performance of kirtan according to the ragas indicated in the Sikh scripture, and on the other hand, the setting of the lyrical hymns, Shabad, according to non-raga-based modern forms inspired by the 20th century music market. The historical depth and continuity, along with the perpetual change and instability, are what the ethnomusicologist Peter Manuel defines as a twin phenomenon, which not only are so common in South Asian cultures, but also keep a tradition like the Gursikh as a lived, fluid, dialogic reality. However, recognizing that the overarching impact of the modern forms since the late 1980s, efforts have started by Sikh scholars and kirtanias to foster the practice of raga-based kirtan. The Sikh Kirtan Renaissance that was well documented by Nirinjan Khalsa Baker led, among various initiatives, to the formation of a discipline taught at university level and institutionalized at the Punjabi University of Patiala under the label of Gurmat Sangeet, with the financial support of the Shri Guru Gyan Prakash Foundation, headed by the late Bibi Jasbir Kaur Khalsa. The Gurmat Sangeet chair and department were established respectively in 2003 and 2005. In a recent interview, the former chair and head of the department, Dr. Gurbeer Singh, affirmed that the objective of the courses is to teach Sikh music as a separate genre from the Hindustani Sangeet. However, courses are within the framework of the Indian educational system without any formal critique of the pedagogical parameters established in the early 20th century, according to the colonially derived model. As I could observe during my visit at Punjabi University, Patiala, most of the students hail from Punjabi Sikh families, and the degree in Gurmat Sangeet allows them to undertake a professional career, either as kirtan singers and accompanists or as teachers who will most likely replicate the same teaching model. In the Western Hemisphere, Sikh musicology was institutionalized in 2011 with the installation at Hofstra University, New York, of the Sardarni Urban Score Endowed Chair that I have the honor to serve since its foundation. At Hofstra, Sikh musicology took a distinct route in terms of teaching and academic objectives. On the one hand, courses are designed for students hailing from diverse cultural, ethnic, and religious background to meet the goals of liberal arts college education. Being a research position, however, The chair also serves to carve out an academic space for the critical study of Gursikh music literature and practices, an area until recently neglected by Indian and Western scholarship. The way I envision Sikh musicology in the Western Academy is an interdisciplinary field at the intersection of ethnomusicology, anthropology of music, and Sikh studies, that to critically examine and document the expressions in which Naad and Shabad are articulated in diverse forms across the ages and context, including the most recent diaspora. For instance, I'm working since 2018 among the newly settled communities of Punjabi Sikhs in southern Italy, in a social fabric built on mafia and fascist culture. And I'm studying how notions and practices of kirtan are a means to retain the Punjabi identity and Indianity in this very endangered context. These expressions are all components of what I describe as a dynamic cultural ecosystem, what Peter Manuel describes as a twin phenomena. And the study of Sikh music literature and practices is indeed an ideal terrain for collegial efforts to ultimately explore the epistemic diversity and sovereignty of the Gursikh vision and the interplays with its sonic heritage as a lived experience. Rag, Naad, Sabad, Soneja, Lage, Sahajatyan. Whereas Rag, Naad, and Shabad constitute a unified field, the study of Gursikh music literature and heritage remain peripheral in Sikh studies, seen as an experience alien to Sikh philosophy and Sikh literature. But the divide between the oral and written, embodied and visual knowledge, art form, philosophy, Sangeet and Vichar are all dyads that are outcomes of colonial modernity, as Arvind Mander well pointed out at the Hofstra conference I organized in 2019. And this divide does not reflect the pre-modern ground of South Asian cultures and the Gursikh vision in particular. Conversely, the Sikh heritage is rarely acknowledged in the musicological literature of South Asia, and always as a subaltern expression of hegemonic pan-Indian traditions, as a regional variant of classical art forms of the 19th century, and as a subgenre of Hindu devotional bhakti practices, or more recently, as a form of New Age world music. This controlled narrative not only has marginalized the study of Gursikh musical heritage, but has especially delegitimized the pre-colonial history of Gurbani Kirtan repertoire and its role in retaining the oral and written memory of ragas, musical forms, and sang poetries of the 12th, 18th century. The Hofstra chair's positionality resonates with the current critique of the Eurocentric music scholarship that contributed to separate and classify indigenous repertoires and practices according to foreign parameters. In ethnomusicology, compelling reflections on the colonial past of the discipline have been advanced since the 1990s. In an attempt to delink from the Eurocentric knowledge and establish a plurality of musicologies as a means to dismantle the singularity of hegemony. Only recently, though, has research focused on decolonial discourses being established in ways that honor the plurality of indigenous epistemologies. And in this context, the Sikh Musicology Chair plays a pioneering role. The decolonial approach taken by Sikh musicology is a key to unlock ways of thinking, knowing, being, and doing that began, but also precede the decolonial enterprise and invasion. It implies the recognition and undoing of the hierarchical structure of race, gender, heteropatriarchy, and class that continue to control life, knowledge. And I'm quoting here the decolonial scholars Bignolo and Walsh. With regard to Sikh musicology, the decolonial approach serves, therefore, to recognize the impact of colonial modernity and re-legitimize the place and the role of Sikh sang poetry in the history of South Asian music, as well as in the very context of Sikh studies as a unified field. Disengaging the inscriptions of colonial modernity means reestablishing the discourse on Gursikh music literature through its own epistemic ground, escaping the classification system and vocabulary that came with the mimetic internalization of frameworks and notions like art form, classical, folk, light, borrowed from the music culture of the Western Romantic period. But my argument is that modernity, like violence, is not only found in systemic structures of thoughts, in vocabulary words, but it's also audible. And looking at the future of Sikh studies, I suggest to explore, next to critical thinking, critical listening. Sunye man, rakhe pao. So Sikh literature, since the time of Guru Nanak, of course, and Kabir, reminds to engage with the Bani by way of listening. Listening is a transversal, non-exclusive experience that anybody can have, and nobody really needs a PhD in musicology to listen critically. While the blueprint of Western universalism and globalization are explicit in the setting of modern forms like the one that Nirinjan played earlier, for instance, what I call audible modernity has been less studied, if not totally underestimated, in relation to the raga-based kirtan. I argue that it is in fact modernity that distinguishes the diverse styles, not the raga-based setting per se. It's in the structure of kirtan, audible modernity, is in the organization of the session, for instance, of the chaunkis that once were included, the Shan, Mangalachara, and then Drupad, Partal. It's in the structure of each composition. It's in the length of the performance, nowadays adjusted to, 4 or 5 minutes, which is like a radio format. It's in the pace of the composition, in the sound of the instruments, the arrangements, the playing techniques of the instruments, the tuning, the embellishments, the voice culture. And with this regard, I would like to also comment about the very desexualized female voices that we tend to hear nowadays. These are voices that as studied in the context of Bollywood music, for instance, by Natalie Sarrazin, are mimicking a Hindu sound and trying to, in a way, take off the Muslimness or the otherness of female voices, as in the nationalist trends in pop and Bollywood music. So going back to critical listening, there are two major approaches within the revival of the raga-based repertory that started back in the late 1980s. On the one hand, we have an approach developed from the middle of the 20th century, and it's what I call the neo-traditional. So from the modern Hindustani raga system, we have a newly composed repertory of songs. But then there is the opposite approach, which is based on the revival of the ragas, starting from the analysis of the repertory of Puratan Shabad reeds that survived, yet survived to this day in written notation and also oral forms, oral memory and recordings. And I have here an example. So the same Shabad, Sant Pahi Satguru Pure, in two versions. One is the neo-traditional, raga-based. It's raga-based, but it's neo-traditional, and it is actually set to rag malkons in Khayal, Stai, Tintal. These are the Singh Bantu. Please let me know if you can hear the sound. Okay, and the other version, thank you, Gurbeer. I'm aware of time and I don't know how to connect the chat. Sorry. The other version is sang by Pai Avtar and by Gurcharan Singh. This is an archival recording that was done by Pai Avtar Singh and Pai Gurcharan Singh, and I thank Pai Baldeep Singh for sharing this very precious recording. And here it is. This is a Drupad in Chertal in Rag Shuddh Bilaval. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to listen to the whole Shabbat, but even if you cannot get the nuances of the differences between Rag Malkans and the Khayal style and the Drupad format, which are Tal, and the setting in Rag Shuddh Bilaval of the second example, you can get the pace is completely different, how the words are distributed in the singing. Now, most of the raga-based kirtan songs that we hear today are actually of the second type, newly composed in the 20th century, and in order to mark their different place in history, we call them neo-traditional standards. While the efforts of some modern composers in writing new repertory are appreciated, recognizing that the intangible heritage of Puratan Shabad reeds is in danger of disappearing, the efforts of the Sardarni Harbans Kaur Chair at Hofstra University have particularly focused on the study and the teaching of the heritage repertories. This is a body of knowledge collected in the Sikh scripture. Sorry. Here it is. Sorry. Okay, here. This is a body of knowledge collected in the Sikh scripture and is an anthology of songs that include ragas and song forms like chant, vara, stapade, not known or practiced in the 20th century Hindustani music, but also songs attributed to poets, saints who lived across South Asia between the 12th and the 15th century. In the Adi Granth, for the first time, Bhakti and Sufi voices were brought together in a selected collection, an anthology of raga-based hymns that until then were only memorized. The anthropologist Stephen Feld writes that sound is a way of knowing the world, and with their acoustic presence, raga-based songs collected in the Sikh scripture enshrine an ecology of knowledges, to quote Boaventura Santos de Souza, inclusive of heterodox voices, equally acknowledged and collectively celebrated. Balbinder Singh Bogle describes this body of raga-based songs as a comparative archive of multi-directional memories made of heterodox voices, remembered and represented as equally legitimate. The Sikh gurus heard the voices of the other as songs echoing pluriversal values. Pluriversality is a decolonial concept that well translates the Gursi critically inclusive vision, its epistemic diversity, a transversal, non-exclusive perspective, as Nirinjan was mentioning earlier, that is opposite to the assimilative force of Western universalism. Then why is pluriversal oral knowledge embodied in raga-based songs relevant today? For scholars, it is an invaluable resource to draw a more inclusive map of pre-modern tradition in their music and their mutual interactions, to contest and radically rethink the control hegemony and hegemonic narrative of South Asian music history. To this topic, in 2019, the two chairs at Hofstra University jointly organized an interdisciplinary conference where, in particular, ethnomusicologists discussed in dialogue with Sikh scholars the heterogeneous fluid ground that predated the colonial modernity, examining for the first time the connections between neighboring traditions. Also, in my teaching experience and through a pluriversal lens, college students are engaged with Sikh thought as a profound transformative experience to critically reflect and navigate sensitive themes such as systemic inequality, racism, gender, and social biases. Students are engaged not only intellectually, but also through an experiential approach to sound poetry. The experience and is a pedagogical process based on the embodiment of knowledge by singing and playing the compositions. And this is a practical approach that I am privileged and I enjoy teaching in a music department. Sikh musicology courses are now included in the music literature and history program that I coordinate, contributing to decolonize the college education. I see the Sikh Musicology Chair at Hofstra as a hub that connects the grassroots of the community at large with academia. From college, students move forward to graduate school so they could apply to graduate programs offered by other Sikh chairs, for instance, or more often they teach in high school, continuing a process, a critical process of thinking and education, educating new generations. Hofstra is also the only university, and I'm about to conclude, that is home to two endowed chairs, establishing in this way a model of interdisciplinary and collaborative approach for a common intellectual project that ultimately is meant to serve the community of students and the Sikh community at large. It is in the university that we have the opportunity to discuss and challenge the conceptual framework of the machine that marginalized and delegitimized the place of Sikh music and Sikh in general in academia, as well as in education. At the same time, reestablishing a critical listening as a part of critical thinking, Sikh musicology contributes to Sikh studies scholarship, reaffirming the need to reconstitute the link that connects sound, literature, philosophy in a unified field, a unified experience of the embodied knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cassio, for that. Interesting. Moving on, sorry, yeah, just have to move on due to time. Moving on, we have Miss Sonia Dhami presenting art, protest as art. Sonia Dhami is a trustee of the Sikh Foundation and CEO of Art and Tolerance. She is the co-editor of the Sikh Art from the Kipani collection, a definitive volume on Sikh art co-published with the Smithsonian Institution, and has also edited a richly illustrated volumes Games We Play. Her work demonstrates the confluence of art, history, religion, and community. Early in her career, she worked on art and architecture projects with Sikh institutions in India, UK, Canada, and the USA. She has been closely associated with organizing, assisting many conferences, community events, publications, and Sikh art displays, including the recent expressions of divinity at the Triton Museum of Art, Santa Clara. She graduated from St. Bede's College in Shimla and earned her master's in business administration from Punjab Agricultural University in Ludhiana. She lives in Fremont, California. And you have the virtual podium, Ms. Dhami.
Sat Shri Akal. So thank you, Gurbeer Singh, for the introduction and very enlightening and thought-provoking talks by Dr. Cassio and Dr. Khalsa. Really touched my heart. My deep gratitude for Dr. Pashora Singh and his team, Tejpal, Gurbeer, for organizing this engaging conference and acknowledging the contributions of the great man, Dr. Nirinjan Singh Kapani, through whose vision and efforts we are all connected here today. I also thank the audience who have taken the time to be here today, especially in these challenging times. The pandemic still raging in the world and has by now touched many of us. Our families and friends who are braving it in India are in our thoughts and prayers, as are our Kisan sisters and brothers who are even today sitting at the borders of Delhi in the ongoing Kisan Mazdoor Andolan, which I have been following closely for many months. As I watched it grow and sustain, I became aware of how it is also inspiring artists to create works for posterity. And I started to take note of the many paintings, some sculptures, prolific graphic art, photography, films, amidst the hundreds of songs and poems. Gradually realizing and appreciating what the artists are doing to show their support to the farmers. My selection, which I'm honored to share with you today, is in no way a complete one and is limited to my own networks, both personal and on the social media. And I also must say my own preferences. So now, without going into the details of the Andolan, which I believe most will be familiar with, let's just dive into the art that has been inspired by this historic Andolan. So starting with the Republic Day parade on 26 January this year, the images of the farmers' protest caught the attention of the world. The visual which flashed across our TV screens was of the authorities getting nails and spikes dug into the roads to prevent the farmers from driving their tractors into the nation's capital. It was shocking and ludicrous at the same time. The farmers responded by planting flowers near those nails and completely turned the narrative. Now, soon after, Rupinder Singh Olak from Seattle created this simple yet powerful composition, all from discarded materials that he picked up on his walk one evening. The nails are symbolically painted blood red color with reference to the nails dug into the roads to contain the protesters within the camps. Artist Gurpreet Singh Bathinda is in this painting showing a worker digging nails into the road, across from whom is a farmer who is sowing paddy in his field. The visual connection is clear, and they're both watched by this pair of intense, boring eyes. The painting is accompanied by a verse. Jad jad hakam darda hai, tad kere bandi karda hai, annadate de agge, fer o lohe diyan killan tarda hai. Now, Gurpreet has been participating in the Morcha for many months, as well as creating over 50 or so artworks and distributing them all for free. And in this painting, which he dedicated to all mothers on Valentine's Day this year, and I'm proud to acquire this painting because for me, it brings out the spirit of the protest. The elderly lady, BBG, is literally reaching out of the frame in the painting, which perhaps can also represent the four walls of the house, which are meant to contain the female space, and perhaps urging or protesting her indignation at the farm laws. Her basanti-colored yellow dupatta flows out of the frame as well and merges into the yellow landscape of the ripened mustard fields. The artist has also included his self-portrait standing amidst the fields, holding the green banner of the Bharatiya Kisan Union, proudly announcing his own association with the land. Now, the first memorial to come up physically at the protest sites just before the Republic Day parade was this sculpture by Devanjan Roy an artist from Bengal. At first glance, it's easy to dismiss it as kitsch and gaudy, but when we know who the figures are, we can then appreciate the underlying symbolism powerfully conveyed by the artist. The sculpture is of Sir Chotu Ram, the colonial era Jat farm leader. He is firmly holding a giant plow in his right hand and carrying over his left shoulder the lifeless body of Sant Ram Singh, who you might recall was the head of the Nanaksar Gurdwara in Karnal and shot himself at the Singhu border in December last year, leaving a suicide note expressing his distress at the farmer's plight. There are interesting parallels and connections here. For one, both leaders, one is a Hindu and the other a Sikh, are named Ram. And this has another connotation with the Hindutva ideology, which has been politicized by the BJP, which is the party in power at the center and whose policies the farmers are protesting against. Secondly, he has connected the two farm movements, one which happened in the early 20th century, led by Sir Chotu Ram, and the one happening today, almost 100 years later, in the 21st century. Interestingly, Sir Chotu Ram is dressed, to my eye, like Mahatma Gandhi, in a dhoti, bringing into focus the commitment of the farmers to a peaceful and non-violent campaign reminiscent of Gandhi's Satyagraha. So it's a lot of information to decipher looking at this seemingly simple sculpture. Moving on to Sukhpreet Singh from Ludhiana, who has painted this masterpiece commissioned by Dr. P.S. Khanuja and visually documents the activities around the tractor march on Republic Day, January 26th. The painting has approximately 200 human figures. On the left, we see farmers marching while in the background, women are sitting in dharna, protesting while another group is cooking on an open hearth. Farmers, young and old, women and men, are advancing on foot, tractors and motorbikes, resolutely yet peacefully under the banners of the Kisan unions and India's tricolor. A Nihang in his distinct headgear is riding along on his horse. There are barricades put up by the armed police to stop the advancing farmers, which has been breached at places. Tractors and people who have broken through are met by the police with lathis and water cannons, disregarding young and old. Some policemen are shown taking aim with their guns. On the right side are the scenes of langar being prepared and distributed, ironically to the very men in khaki. On the sidelines, we see reporters and photographers shooting with their cameras. And in the background in the painting is the central Delhi cityscape of high-rise buildings and the distinctive facade of the colonial era Connaught Place. The gleaming golden dome of Gurdwara Bangla Sahib rises above the rooftops. Next, I would like to share a very interesting conceptual work which incorporates an early 20th century painting, the iconic Three Girls by Amrita Shergill, a pioneer of the modern art movement in India. This 1934 painting inspired the team at the NGO Karti Tarti, a woman-led publishing collective. They took the static, mute, and resigned figures of Amrita's painting and put them atop a tractor, immediately changing the narrative to one of movement and action with the words, Asi Inqalab Haan, emblazoned across the poster, which is available for free in 4 languages, Gurmukhi, Hindi, English, and Shamukhi. I have also acquired a set of photographs by a young photographer, Himanshu Dua, which brings into focus the leadership and participation of women in the protest. When I see this image, it becomes evident to me that within this farmers' movement, there is a larger social change that is happening. Women themselves are now questioning how they are seen, just as women or equal stakeholders in this fight. I recall a recent news feature in the Time magazine and reading these powerful quotes. Jasbir Kaur, a 74-year-old farmer from Rampur, Uttar Pradesh, expresses her indignation to the Supreme Court of India's advice to the farmers to send the women and children back. And she says, I quote, "Why should we go back? This is not just the men's protest. We toil in the fields alongside the men. Who are we if not farmers?" Unquote. An interesting collaboration has developed between Himanshu and the graphic artist Nisha Kaur Sethi, and I quote her here. This artist collaboration serves as a bridge between India and the global diaspora to help build solidarity and continue spreading awareness about what's happening. The photographs were taken on the ground at the Tikri border in India, and the collage art was created in Oakland, California. This series of work is being offered as a social justice tool and as a resource for the people. Please share with your communities and continue educating, speaking out, and showing up at your local action. Unquote. Another photograph shows a stoic and determined Bibi, reminding me of another quote from the Time article in which Gurbeer Kaur in her mid-70s says, I quote, "I am an illiterate woman. I cannot talk well, but I can sit tight. And I will sit here till the next elections if these laws are not called off." Unquote. Now, from the monochrome to the multicolored art of Amandeep Singh of the UK, who goes by the trade name of Inquisitive. He released this work this Vaisakhi, keeping the farmers in his thoughts and reminding them that Guru Gobind Singh is looking over them, just as his 4 sons are serving besides them. The Char Sahibzade are dispersed in the group serving the Sangat, including the youngest Baba Fateh Singh, seen in the foreground. The Baz is perched on the arm of a farmer, and behind him is the cauldron, the deg, filled with food, on the surface of which is the visible Ek Onkar. The Panch Pyare are shown sitting atop the harvester. The artist has made an analogy of the ways the Panch Pyare inspire and reflect amongst the farmers. I quote, "May the beautiful events of Vaisakhi 1699 remind you of the compassion of Daya, to remain strong and determined through the righteousness of Dharam. May any cold nights and the lack of food, water continue to be a reminder of courage, showcased by Himmat when the Guru asked for a head. Commitment to be standing for 100+ days is a true reflection of Mokam, and as a community, we are all leaders and value that through Sahib." In April, the farmers launched the Mitti Satyagrah to honor the martyred farmers by bringing in earthen pots filled with the soil of villages from different parts of India. Another artist from Bengal, Lalan, was deeply moved by this powerful symbolism. Now, just as this march was concluding, he drove from Ahmedabad, where he is a PhD student at the National Institute of Design, to Shahjahanpur on the Rajasthan-Delhi border. And on April 14th, he created this powerful installation built on the road divider on National Highway 48 as a way of offering his contribution to the Kisan Andolan. The structure, modeled after a bed of flowers, honors the 370 people as of April 14th who have died in this struggle. Today, the count is up to 433. The choice of materials and simplicity of the concept are rooted in the essence of the Kisan Andolan. The earthen pots are the farmer's connection with the earth. The iron rods, their steely resolve and strong commitment. Instead of concrete, the artist has allowed the grass to grow at its base. Lalan recalls, I quote, "The best moment for me was when I walked up to the top of the structure for finishing touches, and one of the farmers helping out stopped me and asked me to take off my shoes and said to me, 'Yahan kisi ki samadhi hai. This is a memorial,' unquote. This was all Lalan needed to hear to know that his work had been accepted. Now, most of these artworks are meaningful if they go out into the world. And it is my hope and expectation from all of you to buy these works, support our artists in any way you can, so that they can continue to do their part, which they do so beautifully. Now, apart from these works, films like Kisan Man have already been released, while others like Jamhuriyat by Novita Singh are ready for release. Hundreds of songs and poems have been inspired by the Andolan. And one particularly poignant song titled Basanti Chuniya, written by Amritsar resident Sarabjot Singh Bahal and sung by Rageshri and Samriddhi Sharma, highlights the changing narratives around the roles of women in both the Kisan Andolan as well as their personal spaces. Inspired by the iconic 1927's Mera Rang De Basanti Chola by Ram Prasad Bismil, this song, Basanti Chuniya, was released on the eve of the International Women's Day, which saw some 50,000 women join the morchas from Punjab, Haryana, UP, and Rajasthan. I will conclude my presentation by playing it for you here.
चुनिया मैं रंग दे बसंती चुनिया ओ मैं रंग दे बसंती चुनिया रंग दे बसंती चुनिया मैं रंग दे बसंती चुनिया ओ मैं रंग दे बसंती चुनिया उड़ चुक के गुलाबी नो थुक के मेरा बना लो कोई कोला लुक के देड़ हुंदी ना सलामी चुक चुक के जावे तोरे आना मैं तो रुक रुक के नवी मैं भी ते नवी मेरी दुनिया रंग दे बसंती चुनिया ओ बाबला रंग दे बसंती चुनिया लगे मन कितने के सारे मोड़ के संग वाली संगली नु तोड़ के रूड़ियां नु रावी विच होर रोड़ के तोरा मोटे नाल मोटा तेरे जोड़ के तू कल्ला ने मैं वे हुन हुनिया वे रंग दे बसंती चुनिया ओ माया रंग दे बसंती चुनिया आस रखनी बनेरे बैठे कावते बूहा टप के तुर पैया रावते खंबू गाए साडियां बावते उड़ारी अपनी ऊंचियां हवावां ते असी रहियां नी बेबियां ते मुनिया वे मैनू रंग दे बसंती चुनिया.
Okay, I think I will leave it there and request all of you to please check it out on YouTube. It is by Sarabjot Bahal.
Thank you so much. Given that we are out of time, I think we can take a couple of questions before we start lunch for our 3 panelists. So we do have a comment from Mark Juergensmeyer. Thanks, Sonia, for these moving images and for your lucid and helpful comments and understanding the artistic aspect of the important Kisan Andolan that continues today. Another comment from Dr. Anshul Malhotra. Dear Sonia, this was absolutely brilliant. Enjoyed it so much and such an appropriate way to finish this session.
I just wanted to thank my co-panelists. I'm glad that this is a female panel, by the way. So proud that we touched upon different aspects, also in a critical way, in a creative and yet critical way. So thank you very much to both my panelists. And Sonia, it's a pleasure meeting you virtually.
Same here. The pleasure's all mine, Dr. Cassio. As well as Dr. Khalsa. It was really very thought-provoking, both your presentations, and I'm really feeling myself to be the exalted company today. Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you so much, Sonia. You really opened up the space for us to really reflect deeply upon the Kisan movement and the artistry that's coming out of it, and thinking about how we were all talking about creative expression as a way to express Sikh sovereignty was something that I really saw as a unifying line through all of our work. And Dr. Cassio, I really appreciate your call to thinking about the audible forms of modernity and being able to think, not only think critically, but also listen critically. So that's a very key aspect that I'm taking away from these talks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all three of you for your amazing and thought-provoking presentations.